I'm going to launch mine after I speak for a couple minutes. Okay.
Okay, sounds good. So Greg served in the Peace Corps before becoming a journalist. At the Virginian-Pilot, he carved out a niche where he could spend weeks or even months working on long-form stories. We worked out of the same bureau in the Chesapeake Bureau, and I think he moved downtown at a certain point.
Yep.
When the pilot started to decline, he took a job at the Eastern Virginia Medical School, and later at the Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters, which is the children's hospital in our region, specializing in strategic communication. Now he writes and teaches English as a second language to students in the Ukraine, where he lived, and you also didn't mention on your bio, but you've also written a book.
Yeah, I've written. Yeah. Yes. Okay.
So,
if you put is there any way to tip the thing down?
Yeah.
So I can see the students now.
Yeah, and actually, it's
okay. Now, I had the pleasure. Okay, so let me go ahead and Martin can put my. Okay, so during my time at the Virginian-Pilot, we moved there, and the Virginian-Pilot at that point was a pretty decent paper. It had just won a Pulitzer Prize, and it had a lot of money. Sandra Rowe, who was the editor there, moved on to the Portland Oregonian, where she won numerous Pulitzer Prizes. Jim Raper was a great editor. It really had a really fantastic staff. And as Martin said, I came in from the Peace Corps. I majored in Greek and Latin, not in journalism. And when we moved to St. Petersburg, I started writing freelance, and I got a full-time job at the St. Petersburg Times, and then later moved to the Tampa Tribune and Tampa Magazine. After I left the Virginian-Pilot, I wrote 2 books. I've written like 7 teleplays, a couple screenplays. I've always loved to write, and that's really one of the reasons I try to specialize in writing. I started teaching in Poltava, Ukraine, and they had me on Zoom because of COVID. How many of you students have had classes on Zoom because of COVID? Is that every single person here, right? Yeah. So, they're already dealing with, COVID, having to do things with Zoom. And then in the middle of my class on February 22nd, Putin invaded. So I was in the middle of my class. The people who paid me was the State Department, and they went on to pull out everybody. But my counterpart at the university said no. And President Zelensky said he wanted to keep all the classes going. And so I've been teaching throughout the invasion. There were times when people had no power and they were looking at their cell phones, and sometimes they would hear air raid sirens in the middle of classes. One time nobody showed up because there was the bombing. But it's been really kind of encouraging to see how serious these students are taking their academic careers, despite the fact that they are under constant bombardment by the Russians. Now, Martin told me that this is a writing class, but half of you want to be journalists. How many want to be journalists? Okay. How many want to do strategic communication? Okay. So I see some people who want to be journalists and want to do strategic communication. After I left the Virginian-Pilot, I went to Eastern Virginia Medical School, which had a really horrible relationship with the newspaper, and I turned around that relationship. And then I went to Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters, and just as a bad story, they told me that none of the professors did research, and I found out that that was completely wrong. So I focused on doing research. So again, throughout my career, I have focused on a certain type of writing, and I call it, I'm going to pull it up here. What I do when I'm writing a story is I identify the dragons. Does anybody have any idea what that might mean? Identify the dragons? Now I need to share this. Okay, so I'm going to share this screen, identify the dragons. Anybody have an idea what that might mean? If so, raise your hand. Okay. I always looked at a news story, and I know you're learning different forms of the news story. You're learning the inverted pyramid. Martin's probably going to teach you that. I don't know if he has taught you that. And you're going to learn the donut, which is, I think, another good form. But I always saw the story as a quest. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to build my story like it's a quest. And the person who wants to be a journalist in the front row there, tell me what is one of the difficulties right now with newspapers that didn't exist when I started? What do you think?
Like you have to put out news pronto as soon as it happens, or else it gets lost.
You have to put out news as soon as it happens, or it gets lost. And are they big stories or are they little stories?
It's generally smaller because you want to get the most pressing events in right as they're happening.
Okay, and that's really, really important. And today we've got a 24-hour news cycle. You have a drumbeat of, you got to get this in, you have to get this in, you have to get this in. But what I would do is I would take a story that had already been reported maybe a month or so before, and I would wait until the reporter said, okay, well, see what you can do with it. And I would build a story around that. So let me give you an example. I was considered King Arthur's Court is a great example of identifying the dragons. So somebody has kidnapped Guinevere from King Arthur's Court. Do people know this story? If you do, raise your hand. Okay. So who comes to the rescue? It's Sir Lancelot. Okay, so Sir Lancelot leaves the castle, and the first thing he encounters is 3 fire-breathing dragons. So he kills those dragons, and he moves on, and he encounters 2 dragons that don't breathe fire. Okay? And then he has to go to this castle, and it's in a valley, but the valley is guarded. Okay, the valley is guarded by, what would the valley be guarded by?
Dragon.
A dragon. Okay, so what if it's guarded by a baby dragon? Is that a good story? What do you think? What do you think? Is that a good story?
Feel like a moral conflict in it.
Seems like a good
Well,
story.
More conflict. Ooh.
Okay, but what is kind of the problem with the structure of this story?
Stakes de-escalate. Yeah.
What's that?
A little louder.
The stakes de-escalate.
The stakes de-escalate.
The stakes go down. The
The stakes yeah.
go down. And when you're writing a story, what you need to do is you need to have the stakes go up. And sometimes it's very hard. You have to find the stakes in a story. And when I was starting at the end of my career, as Martin said, and to be honest with you, Martin was a great photographer. If I was paired with Martin, I always knew the story would get good play. So keep that in mind. So the thing you have to identify are what are the stakes in a story. Okay, and you have to identify what is the most important stake. What's the biggest barrier? Now, when I was writing for newspapers, I like to do long form journalism. I like to do really long stories. And when I was at the Tampa Tribune, sometimes they would have so many ads. This was before Craigslist. They would say, make it longer, add something else, put in a sidebar. And I always thought, they just were demanding more and more. And after a while, after Craigslist, after newspapers started losing advertising, everything got squeezed down. I was at the launch of USA Today, and USA Today became famous for having little, smaller and smaller stories. So what I had to do is I had to figure out a way to keep people reading long stories. So how do you think you might be able to do that?
Having stakes progress like a They get higher and higher.
The
Escalating
stakes,
stakes.
the stakes get higher and higher. And what I did is I started going through Dickens. You know, Dickens used to write like a little nickel story, and he would pass it out to people. And then the only way he did well is if they wanted the next story and the next story. So he had great cliffhangers. He had great stakes, and then he had to get people who were addicted to the story. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to make my stories as I described them, and I didn't get to the point. I'm going to be describing a story that Martin and I worked on, but I wanted to do a story that didn't have a jump. And so maybe the story would be 12 inches long, but you couldn't finish without knowing the next story. So each of those 12 inches had to have another complication. And if you're doing strategic communications, this is really important. This is really important. If you're working for, if you're working for a children's hospital, for instance, and somebody really needs to understand children's medicine. Somebody really needs to understand that the doctors there have to study longer just to become pediatric, like a pediatric heart surgeon. They have to get qualified as a heart surgeon and then do another fellowship as a pediatric heart surgeon just to be paid less, because a pediatric heart surgeon gets paid less than an adult heart surgeon. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to find stories that had stakes that were growing. And what I want to do is I want to talk about a story that Martin and I did, and it was about pilots. So we had a guy, and his name was Tom Schrantz, and he had one goal in his life, a huge goal. Tom Schrantz, this is not him, but he wanted to be a fighter pilot. So how do you become a fighter pilot? Somebody talk to me. Does anybody know how you become a fighter pilot? What's the one thing you have to do if you want to be pardon me?
Basic training.
Okay, basic training. Now, if you want to be a Navy fighter pilot, you have to go, okay? So if you want to be a Navy fighter pilot, you have to go to Annapolis, okay? And Annapolis, that's a really hard school to get into. You have to have great grades. You have to be like the quarterback of the football team. You have to have, just evidence that you're really, really serious about what you want to do. And oftentimes, the only way you can get into Annapolis is you need a letter from a senator in your state saying, I recommend him to go to Annapolis. And if somebody else gets the letter, you're screwed. You can't go to Annapolis. The senator can only recommend one student. So Tom Schrantz had to do all this stuff. He had to get straight A's. He had to be, he was on the football team. He had to do a whole lot of good deeds. And he managed to get a letter, and he managed to get into Annapolis. So when you go to Annapolis, can you just go and say, I want to be a fighter pilot? What do you think? No. In Annapolis, you have three things you can say. I want to be a fighter pilot. I want to be an engineer, or I want to be a crewman or something. And at the end of your term at Annapolis, this is a ceremony. And you tear open what you're going to get, and it tells you that you are in the pilots. You're going to be trained to be a pilot, or you're going to train to be an engineer. So Tom Schrantz had to get into the pilot track. If he wanted to be a fighter pilot. Otherwise, he was done. So Tom Schrantz got into the fighter pilot track. Okay, he got into the pilot track. So that's a pretty big stake. The first stake is getting into Annapolis. If you don't get into Annapolis, you're done. Second is being selected to be a pilot. If you don't get into the pilot track, you're done. But also a lot of people want to be a helicopter pilot. They just love. I knew one guy, he just absolutely loved flying helicopters. And, some people, they want to fly these really difficult things. They have a big disc on the back, and it's radar, and it detects everything. It has propellers, and it is incredibly difficult to land because it's so top heavy. This is a E-26 Hawkeye. Some people like the idea of the flying the planes where the rotors can go up and they can take off vertically. But some people, like Tom Schrantz, he wanted to be a fighter pilot. Which do you think is the most competitive? Which is the most competitive?
Fighter pilot.
Fighter pilot. So again, when you're going through the training, you have three choices. You can say, I want to be a fighter pilot, I want to fly helicopters, or I want to fly EC-2 Hawkeyes, or I want to do cod flights. But again, Tom Schrantz had to be selected for the fighter pilot track. If he wasn't selected for the fighter pilot track, his career was over. His career was over. So he got into Annapolis, Dragon 1. He got selected for the pilot track, Dragon 2. He got selected to be a fighter pilot, to train to fly F-18s, Dragon 3. Is that the end? Is that the end of the Dragons? Okay, so now you're in the fighter pilot track, and you have to do things like the helo dunker. Does anybody know what a helo dunker is? They strap you into this metal thing, and you're on top of a pool, and you have a lot of people inside it, and they all have blindfolds on, and they submerge it. Now you can see there's some scuba divers around there. Now, what would you do if they submerged you in something like that, and there were 8 people there, and there was only one exit? What do you think you might do?
Panic.
What's that?
Panic.
Panic. What happens if you panic?
You die.
You not only you die, but if you panic, you're out. If you panic, you did not pass. So you have to learn to be calm. You have to learn to hold your breath. You have to learn to help other people out, and you have to get out of there without panicking. If you panic, now these people can help you. You aren't going to die because they can give you oxygen. But if you panic, and a lot of people do, you're out. So Tom Schrantz had to go through this helo dunker, as do all the pilots. They lost way too many pilots who went into the water and panicked. So again, he had to go through this. He passed. The next thing you have to do, he had to go, and Martin and I went down to Key West, and they had to dogfight. And again, how many people have seen Top Gun? I think a lot of people have seen Top Gun. Okay, so when you're flying a jet, you have G's. I actually got a chance to fly an F-18 during this time. And when I was in the jet, the guy went along the runway and then he went straight up. And when he does that, all the blood rushes out of your head and you pass out. You pass out. And you have to learn how to squeeze. They have these G suits where it's squeezing all the blood to your head, because one of the hardest things is to pass out. So if you're a fighter pilot and somebody is forcing you to turn really hard and you pass out, that's not good. So you have to succeed in beating the other pilots. Now, what we're doing is we are eliminating. Tom Schrantz got into Annapolis. How many people apply to Annapolis and don't get in? A lot. Tom Schrantz got into the pilot selection group. How many people apply for pilot selection group and don't get in? A lot. Tom Schrantz survived the helo dunker. How many people don't survive the helo dunker? A lot. Tom Schrantz went and had a dogfight, and he won. So each level, you have people who are getting out of the pilot. They're getting out of becoming a pilot. And at that time, I don't know if it's true today, but at that time, the Navy had a policy is if you don't progress, you're out of the Navy. They kick you out of the Navy. So Tom Schrantz wanted to be in the Navy. He wanted to be a fighter pilot, but if he didn't pass the helo dunker, say, okay, he was out of the Navy. If he panicked in the helo dunker. Now, I think sometimes they say, well, you can do something else. but you can't become a pilot because they don't want somebody who failed at one thing going down and saying, well, can I fly helicopters? They want to make sure that you really want to do that. Now you can appeal and sometimes you can stay in the Navy, but then it was called up or out. So Tom passed. And the next thing you have to do is you have to land on an aircraft carrier. Land on an aircraft carrier. And you see this little strip here? You see it's all lined up. You've got all these jets on there. You have to land on an aircraft carrier. And that's not really very easy. Sometimes you go too far. Sometimes the cable doesn't work. That's one of the worst things that can happen is you run into the back of the ship because the ship is going up and down, and you have to time it so that you're perfectly synced with the back of the ship. And they have a ball, and you call the ball, and you have to rely not on your eyesight. You have to rely on the ball and just have confidence that if you call the ball and you're on the ball, you'll get on the back of the aircraft carrier. So you have a carrier landing, okay? Carrier landing is very, very difficult. They have a hook on the bottom of the plane. It hooks onto the cable, and then the cable slows you down. You have to accelerate the whole way in case you miss it. But they have 3 cables, and if you miss the cable, you have to accelerate so that you can come around again, okay? So again, and then after you do the carrier landing, which Tom Schrantz did successfully, you have to do what's called a night carrier landing. Martin, do you remember being out there for the night carrier landing?
I remember. Do you remember what I forget which pilot it was, but what their quote was when he asked him, what's the main thing to do for a carrier landing? And he said something like, you have to control your terror.
You have to control your terror.
That was it was a great quote.
The people who do night carrier landings, they record their heartbeat and their respiration. And their heartbeat and respiration is higher than somebody who is under active combat with somebody firing bullets and missiles at them. So Tom Schrantz had to do a night carrier landing, and I managed to get something in there that would record his heart rate and his breathing. And he was just breathing so hard, but he managed to do a night carrier landing. So he became a pilot. So what are the dragons? How would you structure this story? Now, in this case, this is before I was able to break stories down and before they realized that the news hole was shrinking. So I had to break it into two stories, unfortunately, but I could have broken this into other stories. So somebody else other than the guy in the front row, how would you break this story down? What do you think? What do you think? Let's see, there's a woman in white right behind him. Yeah.
I would probably say.
Go ahead and introduce yourself. What's your name?
My name is Elaney Bowe.
Elaney?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good name. Okay.
I would probably break it in between when he got on the pilot track. So everything before that, and then the other part after he got on the pilot track.
Okay. Now, what if they said, okay, break it into 6 pieces?
I would probably break it into kind of each event. So Annapolis, pilot track, and then each of the pilot things. But maybe if there's more than 6, maybe combine the 2 kinds of carrier landings. Okay. And in the case of this, I had to combine a lot of those things. But where does the dragon come in the story? Where does the dragon enter in the story? Probably even before he gets to Annapolis, because that even in itself is very difficult. Well,
and where does the defeat of the dragon end up in the story?
When he
somebody else other than Elaney what's your name in the front row?
Me?
Yeah.
No, I'm Daniel.
Daniel. Okay, so somebody other than Elaney and Daniel. Where would each story end? What do you think? Where would each story end?
When he becomes a pilot.
When he becomes a pilot, that would be the end. After he does, but before he becomes a pilot, what is the dragon that he has to conquer? A night carrier landing. So you end at the night carrier landing where he successfully comes down. He's incredibly nervous. He hits one of the cables, maybe the first, second, or third cable, and that is the end of his quest. And after that, he is a pilot. He is a full-fledged fighter pilot, and he has to go. He has to do a lot more training. But after that, he is a full-fledged fighter pilot. At any point before that, or even at the night carrier landing, he would be kicked out of the Navy. So the stakes are really high. So I would end with the night carrier landing. And the fact that he's a pilot might even just be a short epilogue, so he's a pilot now. So again, I think the defeat of the dragon comes at the end of the story, okay? Now, the people who want to do strategic communications, is it Daniel? Are you the one in the front row?
No,
That's Daniel.
I'm Daniel.
I'm Jeffrey.
Okay, Jeffrey, you were thinking of doing strategic communications. So tell me a little bit about, okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Tell me a little bit about what you think is important in strategic communications.
It's a great question. I think probably I don't know.
Anybody? Eleni, what do you think? Or Daniel, what do you think?
Can you please ask the question again?
If you want to be strategic communications, for instance, I was in charge of media relations at Eastern Virginia Medical School and also in charge of media relations at Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters. So if you want to be in strategic communications, what's one of the lessons you get from identifying the dragons? What's one of the things you can do?
Surround yourself with different perspectives.
Surround yourself with different perspectives, but also know what it takes. When I went to Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters, people were not aware that doctors had to go to school for another 2 years just to get paid less. And that became a big part of my message. That became a big part of my message to the media. Is, this is a doctor who cares so much about treating children that he went to school longer just to be paid less. And that's a powerful message to the media. The other thing is when I get, and this is kind of a horror story, but when I went to CHKD, I asked the person who was in charge of actually a vice president, I just asked what kind of research the doctors were doing. And she says, well, our doctors don't do any research. And that was just wrong. And so what I did is I identified the research the doctors were doing, and I broke the stuff the doctors were doing down into specific difficulties that they had to overcome to, one, prove their point, because research is always a question. So you have a question about research. They had to prove their point. They had to do a literature review. They had to do a whole lot of steps to get something published. And they got things published. And the truth is, medical research, if you've ever read it, and I encourage you to try, I would read the abstract. And during the abstract, I might have to look up 15 words in the dictionary. And, trying to understand what was going on in the medical research, you really have to delve into it and really do your homework so that you can understand what the doctors are doing. And so I got a real reputation for, one, making it clear to the media that these doctors really care about kids. How do I show that they really care about kids, Eleni?
You gather stories about their experiences with them and why they do it in the first place.
Okay, and the fact that they went to school longer and got paid less. Daniel, who's the lady sitting next to you?
I'm Colin.
Okay. And what's your first name?
Colin Brown.
Oh, Colin Brown. Okay. Oh, is it late? Oh, it's a man. I'm sorry. Okay,
No worries.
Colin Brown. You're at a distance, so I can't really see your
Yeah,
face.
I have the very long hair, you know.
Okay. Well, that's fine. So again, what's your interest? What is your interest in writing? What do you hope to do?
Definitely journalism. I think mainly in terms of being a political correspondent. You know.
Okay.
Focus on politics.
Okay. Good. And is there anybody in the room who just basically wants to do strategic communications?
Maybe not.
Well,
Go ahead.
Okay. Now, one thing that tends to happen is people in journalism school, a lot of times they want to be a journalist, but the number of journalists who are working today is declining. It's really declining. It's really, really difficult to get your foot in the door as a journalist. And a lot of times you end up settling for a job where you're doing strategic communications for a company that maybe you like or maybe you don't like. But I think the most important thing is you need to become a good storyteller. Okay? So with a good storyteller, you want to be able to hold off and tell your story in order and build on identifying the dragons. Daniel, do you know anybody? Daniel, do you know anybody you consider a really good storyteller?
yes, Mo Rocca. He has a good podcast called Mobituaries.
Okay. And so how does the Mobituaries, how does that work? Yeah, I've heard Mo Rocca. So how does that work?
So what he usually does is he gives some background about the time period. That's usually like a prologue, and then he introduces the subject.
Okay.
And then it follows the people very close to that subject's life, and then sets up that whole narrative to their career, what they did, and then where they ended up, and their death, and all that.
Okay. And what does he have? What I would call dragons? Does he have challenges that they have to overcome?
I would say so. He had a great episode about a performer who was in the original cast of A Chorus Line and Cats, who passed away in the AIDS epidemic.
Oh, okay. So this is somebody who's like going up as a performer, and then he got AIDS, and that was his dragon. That's what laid him low.
Yeah.
Does anybody listen to An American Life or The Moth?
Yes.
Because I think American Life and The Moth are really good at shaping stories. And again, they're looking at the challenges that people face. And The Moth is really cool because people go up there and they tell their own stories. And they have story consultants that come in, and those story consultants help them shape their story. And a lot of times at the very end, they are, the stories keep people engaged because they are very, 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 they build so gradually. Now, when you are doing a story, let's say you're doing background. Let's say you're listening to Mo Rocca. When he's doing background, tell me how he does background.
Like background information on the subject.
Yeah, how does it do background?
What he interviews a lot of the ooh gosh, he probably
Okay,
does.
let me just ask you. Do you know Eleni very well?
No.
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 Okay. Now you're wanting to do background on Eleni. Eleni ends up being an award-winning journalist, and she was in your class with you, and you end up being an award-winning journalist. Okay, I've got something going on, and you end up being an award-winning journalist, and you wanna put together something on Eleni. So how would you? What is Eleni's background? Let me hear you interview Eleni to find out something about her background.
Eleni, tell me a little bit why you decided to become a journalist.
My high school journalism teacher really inspired me. He gave me great opportunities, such as covering community events as well as school events, and a lot of mentorship, and that solidified my decision.
How did that teacher mentor you?
He gave me some of the more kind of bigger, hard news hitting stories. He also gave me a lot of advice just in general about life and journalism.
What was some of the advice that he's provided to you?
One of my favorite pieces of advice is when you're writing a story and you get to, if you ever use the word very, like very good, whatever, cross out the word very and put damn, because both are bad.
Yeah.
And have you carried that over to your professional career?
I have. I rarely ever use that word like in general when writing.
Yeah. And do you think that made you win the award?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let me go ahead and ask Eleni. Eleni, where are you from?
I'm from here. Have lived in Muncie my whole life.
Okay, and what did your mom and dad do?
They are actually both nurse practitioners, and were very adamant that I do not go to nursing school.
Okay, they did not want you to be a nurse.
Yeah.
How did they feel when you decided you wanted to become a journalist? Were they encouraging?
Yeah, they were they saw that I was really passionate about it and that I was, pretty good at it, and they felt it was a good path for me and who I am and how I work.
Okay, was there anybody who was saying, you'll never get a job, it's really a hard thing to do in your life?
Maybe not anybody that I can think of at the moment specifically, but there would be people who were like, oh, there's no such thing as journalism now, everything is fake, everything is, biased and things like that. So it was kind of more of like a general thing, maybe rather than a specific person.
Okay, now Daniel, can you see how some of that might be part of Eleni's background as well?
You blew me out of the water.
What's that?
You blew me out of the water.
Yeah, but again, you want to start out where they lived. What street did you live on?
North Williamson Road.
Okay, and was it a middle class? Was it a nice street? Was it a good how would you describe your house?
My house is relatively small. Up until maybe 5 years ago, we had the original doors and carpets and stuff, so it very violently looked like it was still the 60s in there.
Okay. Now, why did your parents not want you to become a nurse?
I mean, I kind of didn't want to anyway, but they were just so, it's hard, and also they probably were a little bit jaded because, they see kind of what most people don't see about healthcare and how it's difficult for the caretakers and the patients.
Okay. And did they discourage you from being a nurse before COVID or after COVID?
I would say both, but definitely more afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah, because for a while everyone was clapping for nurses, and then they were saying all the medical profession is trying to kill me.
Yeah.
Okay, so Colin, interview Daniel. Daniel, go ahead and interview Daniel. And
Right.
model what I did with Eleni.
So Daniel, where did you grow up?
I grew up in a small. Before I moved to Indiana in the 4th grade, I lived in a small town in Illinois called Cary.
All right. And what did your parents do for a living?
My mom was a educator. She worked at a university in Chicago called Roosevelt, and my dad was a fundraiser.
All right. And what did you think when you went into journalism? What did you think?
What did they think? Gosh, they gave me so much support out of that, and my dad being this hipster type. Loved the fact that I was getting into this sort of writing niche.
Fair. And was there anyone in your community who inspired you down that path?
I had a teacher in my music and sound production class. He encouraged me for my final project to do a NPR styled news story, and that pushed me over the edge to really think more about how I can tell a narrative.
Fair. And from there, after doing that project, was there anyone who reached out to you? Anyone who provided you with the resources that started your career?
Well, because of Masterson telling me to do that project, it was probably a main driving factor in how I got a job for Indiana Public Radio.
Fair.
Okay. Good job, Colin. Good job. Now, he did a little more background than you did in your first thing with Eleni. But let me tell you one common thread with both your stories. You both had a really good teacher who inspired you. Isn't that right? Colin, did you have a really good teacher?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah. So you had a really good teacher who inspired you. And that to me is a really important thing. And so much about journalism is having somebody that you feel believed in you and convinced you that you could do it. Now, I think journalism right now is really at a crossroads. And Martin and I were talking about this. And I think, there was a time just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I was invited to talk at a journalism school in Ukraine. And all the people before then had written for people, and they were writing basically propaganda. And my topic was, how do you tell the difference between opinion and fact? And I just was really amazed at how difficult it was for these people to tell the difference between opinion and fact. And when I look at the landscape today, I see in America there are a lot of people who have a difficulty separating opinion from fact. Okay? And I think the most important, in fact, I keep seeing ads where somebody says, we do great fact-based journalism. Well, journalism should be based in fact, but a lot of it is not based in fact. So what I would encourage is, I just think when you're telling a story, it has to be true. You can't make things up. Even if you're writing, they'll identify the dragons have to be real dragons. They have to be real challenges. And I think you really are at a point now where the news hole is getting smaller and more people are saying there's no real news out there. There's only opinion. That's kind of what Eleni was saying. It's not really news, it's only opinion. So again, I think you have a job, and it could be you're doing strategic communications, and it could be you're doing journalism. But to me, the most important thing in journalism, the most important thing is to tell the truth. To tell the truth as accurately as you can. So
we have a question over here. If you have,
absolutely. Yeah. No, I was just going to say. So I'm going to stop right now and just open it up for questions.
Can you come over a little closer?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
Okay. And what's your name?
Amelia?
Amelia. Okay. My daughter's name is Emily. So.
Oh, look at that. No, I think a lot of fact versus opinion has to do with how it's actually described a lot in the journalism world. At least in my perspective, what I notice a lot when it's fact-based, it can be very short and very brief a lot of the time, and you don't go much in depth into it unless it's from an actual source. Whereas opinion, you can see a lot more of your personality, and you really get into describing what it is, how it is, where it originated from, and so what. So it goes a lot into how it could be described a lot in journalism.
I think that's a good point. But I think there is a point at which, and I think it's on the left or the right, you have people who want to make you mad. And I think when Fox News settled the Dominion thing, they knew they were lying. That's one of the elements of the settlement, is they knew what they were saying was not true, but they knew the only way to keep their audience was to get them mad and to tell these lies. And I think especially when you're doing opinion pieces, you have to really make sure that you are anchoring it to facts. And I do agree. I did long form journalism, and I loved long form journalism, but I never strayed away from the facts. And I never, in fact, one of the things I always said is, when you're writing long form journalism, kill the journalist. You never want, you want to avoid. Now, I know Mo Rocca, he uses his name, but you want to just, when you're writing long form journalism, try to kill the journalist. Try to just present what you see. And I think that's one of the best advice I ever got, is just try to describe what you see on a day-to-day basis. But no, I think that's a really good point. But facts don't have to be short. It doesn't have to be the boiling.
No, they don't. It's just
the boiling point of water is 212. It can be longer. It can be stretched out. Okay. Anybody else have questions?
If anybody does have questions, or Greg, I don't know how much more time you have. There's nobody who comes in this room after us.
Okay.
Anybody want to stick around for questions? This is typically the time the class would be over.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, thank you so much for allowing me to talk to you. I hope you've learned something from what I've taught you. And again, the inverted pyramid is really an important element of news writing, but it's an element of news writing that fits in short chunks. It fits in. You have 10 inches to tell the story, and you do it in an inverted pyramid. And even the donut can be relatively short. But what I want to do is I want to use identifying the dragons to take the 10 inches and make it like potato chips. I can't eat just one. I need to eat the whole thing. And, I've been nominated for 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and I've won a lot of writing awards. And it's just always helped me to keep my focus on that. So thank you so much for being here. And I really appreciate the chance to speak to you. And good luck in your careers.
Thank you.
Thank you.